And now to the debate. The first candidate to respond will be Ms. Kasser. And the question is, the Special Transportation Fund is going bankrupt faster than previously feared by mid-2022. How would you fix the red ink? Tolls, higher fares, higher taxes? And if not any of those remedies, what are the alternatives?
Thank you. Thank you, Sandy, Kay, Nancy, Becky, Joanne, the entire League of Women Voters for hosting this debate. It's an honor to be here, and it's a special honor to be here on this day and this year, which marks the 100th anniversary, not just of the founding of the League, but also the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage. And thank you everyone who's watching from home. It is an honor to serve as your state senator. And I'm so glad that we're opening with this question, because this was one of the issues that I ran on in 2018. We have an infrastructure crisis in our state. We have a special transportation fund that is now set to become insolvent 2 years earlier than expected in 2022, as you just said. And we have to address it. This has been a crisis in the making for decades, and we can't avoid it. That is why I took the idea of tolls, which every state on the East Coast has, and brought it to Hartford and fought hard for it, because really the choice we have is not whether to pay for infrastructure or not. We cannot let it crumble, because it's the foundation of our economy and the reason why businesses will or will not move to Connecticut. We have to pay for it one way or another. So really the choice is, do we pay for our infrastructure 100% with taxes, which is the system that we have now, or do we pay half price by allowing out-of-state drivers who use our roads, millions of them use our roads every year, to pay half the bill? So it's really the question, do we pay full price or half price? I brought that to Hartford. I fought hard for it. Unfortunately, we lost the battle, but I won't give up.
Mr. Fazio, same question.
First of all, thank you to the League of Women Voters for hosting tonight, and thank you to my opponent for joining me. There is not a revenue problem in our state for transportation. Connecticut spends the third most per capita of any state on transportation in the entire country. And that's on top of the fact that we already pay the second highest taxes of any state in the entire country. My opponent's proposal for $800 million of new tolling revenue in Connecticut, which equates to about $583 on the average family in our state, is only insult to injury. We have a spending problem in our state, including on transportation. We do not have a revenue problem. So my proposals to make the Special Transportation Fund solvent are fourfold. First, spend the money that's already designated to the STF on transportation. Stop diverting it to other parts of the government's budget. We've already rated the Special Transportation Fund $1 billion over the last 20 years. Second, we need to change the rules around construction in our state. Project labor agreements and other rules add as much as 20 to 30% to the cost of building, according to several studies. Third, we need an audit of the Department of Transportation in our state, which is wasteful. Finally, we need to prioritize the most high-value investments in our state. That means 95 Metro North, which is getting slower, and the Merritt Parkway. It means no more upstate boondoggles like the New Britain Busway and the Hartford train line to Springfield, Massachusetts, which is a waste of taxpayer money. We can do this without new taxes or fees.
Anything to add?
Yes, I do. Thank you. We have both a revenue and a spending problem, which is why tolls was not my entire solution. The entire solution to our infrastructure problem is also to have an infrastructure bank. And that is an idea, a proven solution that works in many states, including Florida. And that's how you can bring in billions of dollars in private funding, leverage public funding to magnify $1 in public funding becomes $8 to $10 that we can actually spend. That's how we get the billions of dollars we need to fix our failing bridges, to make our trains faster, and to really transform and modernize our infrastructure. And yes, we do need to make the Department of Transportation more efficient and more accountable. And that's exactly what my bill would have done, SB 70, that I did pass on the Senate floor. And You know, another thing we need to fix is the way that infrastructure projects are decided and determined. There has been a system where they are given out as political favors to legislators based on seniority and other issues, and that's not right. We should be doing infrastructure projects based on the economic impact that it will have for the entire state. So taking a holistic view, having an infrastructure bank to multiply public funds with private financing, that's public-private partnerships, that's what it is, and also having a consistent revenue stream with tolls.
I'll just add quickly that the average person in Connecticut is paying about $1,000 for infrastructure in Connecticut compared to the average person across the country, less than $500. There is no revenue problem for infrastructure in this state. So adding taxes and fees to families that are already hurting is just not the right thing to do. And the tolling bill that was advanced in the beginning of last year itself was tried to be passed with political favors themselves, including a new train station, a duplicative train station in Bridgeport to the Bridgeport delegation, and exemptions for the Danbury delegation, and so on and so forth. So the games are still being played. The public trust is broken. We can't tolerate any new taxes or fees on the working people in this state.
Ready for the next question?
May I just have one last rebuttal? Thank you. Hey, look, it's very easy to say no to new ideas. It's very easy to say no to everything. What's a lot harder is to actually come up with solutions that work. And in fact, our tolls bill was decimated because of Republican opposition, fierce opposition every step of the way. And every time we asked, well, what's your solution? How do you want to fund this? They didn't have a solution until the very last moment. Actually, in February of this year, they said, well, let's drain the rainy day fund. Let's drain our state savings account. If we had done that, if Republicans had been in charge this year and drained the rainy day fund, this state would not have been able to withstand COVID. That rainy day fund is what saved us and is what is putting us on a course of economic recovery.
Just briefly, I'm not saying no. I gave a 4-point plan for how to spend our tax dollars more efficiently. Second, the rainy day fund was built by the Republican budget in 2017 due to the volatility cap that was passed. And third, Republican support had nothing to do with the failures of my opponent's transportation efforts. The Democrats have 60% majorities in both houses of the state legislature, and they have the governorship. This failed because moderate Democrats wouldn't go along, because the people in the state rose up, because there was a grassroots effort against imposing tolls, because people understand that they're taxed enough already in this state.
All right, next question. Mr. Fazio, you're first to respond. 2/3 of Connecticut gun homicides occur in our 3 largest cities, and the victims are disproportionately people of color. If elected, what measures would you push for to reduce community gun violence? And are you in favor of increased funding for community-based gun violence prevention programs?
This is a very important question, and this is a civil rights issue. Public safety and protecting the most vulnerable is a fundamental responsibility of our government. That's why I'm opposed to the new radical policing bill that was passed in July by our state government, just 2 weeks after it was introduced, with only one public hearing over Zoom, that's already leading to a spike in gun violence in our cities. In New Haven this year, the amount of homicides have more than doubled. That's the closest city in Connecticut with ongoing comp stats. We know that in Stamford itself, that there's been an uptick in shootings this summer since the bill passed. That's been reported by the Stamford Advocate. It's been reported by the Stamford Police. And even the governor acknowledges that there's an uptick this year in gun violence around Connecticut. We have pretty strict laws in the state about guns. But now, due to this bill and due to the backlash against proactive policing, we won't be able to enforce those rules in order to keep guns out of the hands of criminals, repeat offenders, people who are a danger to themselves and others. We need good proactive policing policies in order to keep our most vulnerable populations safe.
Ms. Kasser?
Thank you. I am very proud to be endorsed by both Connecticut Against Gun Violence and Moms Demand Action for common sense gun reform, because those are the groups, the foremost groups in our state that have been battling gun violence for decades. And together with them, we passed important gun safety legislation, in fact, 3 bills this past year. I'm committed to advancing gun safety and to upholding our current laws. We actually don't know where my opponent stands because he's never answered these questions from the questionnaires of CAGV and Moms Demand, which require a commitment to upholding our gun safety laws, and also a commitment to investing in community programs which have proven to be very successful in reducing gun violence.
Anything else?
I'll just say that I'm for rigorously enforcing the gun laws in this state in order to keep guns out of the hands of criminals and people who are clear present danger to themselves and others. The problem with the policing bill passed this summer, and I'll note that I was endorsed by the Stamford Police Association and the Greenwich Police Union, who are putting their lives at risk in order to protect vulnerable communities from violence. If we step back from proactive policing, that is what's going to put more illegal guns on the street. Banning consent searches, which is part of the policing bill, is going to keep illegal guns on the street. That's how hundreds of illegal guns have been taken off the street in recent years around Connecticut. So it's one thing to have laws, and we have strict gun laws in Connecticut, and it's going to stay that way. But you also have to enforce them, and that's where good proactive policing comes into play.
All right, next question, and Ms. Kasser, you're first to respond. When Hurricane Isaias made landfall, it left more than 800,000 customers powerless for 10 days. Eversource is accused of failing to respond, poor planning, and lack of information to customers and municipalities. What changes would you support to address these issues and help bring Connecticut into a new era of power delivery?
Thank you so much for that question. That was a devastating event for people in the state and also for our economy. The economy basically screeched to a halt for 8 days. People couldn't work. So it was also a wake-up call, and I'm very happy to say that we have passed legislation that is not a complete solution, but it is a significant step forward on this issue. And, after that storm happened, I helped dozens of constituents who reached out to me who couldn't contact Eversource or Optimum. They couldn't get a person on the phone. They were, for the first few days, they were being stalwart and saying, okay, we can get through this, and not complaining. But after those first few days, people really started to be concerned, and with good reason, because they couldn't work, their kids couldn't go to school. It was really a devastating event. So during the storm, after the storm, I worked with Eversource and Optimum directly to restore service to people who had lost it and to get them to do their job faster. Then, when we went back to special session 2 weeks ago, we passed the Take Back Our Grid Act, which establishes a new dynamic between our public utilities and the public, the consumers that they serve, and puts more power back in the hands of the public by creating performance-based standards for their power, but also for their executive compensation. So now we finally have performance-based standards which include customer satisfaction, communications, the speed at which they restore power. All of those factors will be determining how Eversource is able to function going forward. So we have more oversight over Eversource.
Fazio?
Half of the town of New Canaan, which is part of our district, was without power for a week. Many parts of Greenwich were without power for more than a week. That's totally unacceptable. Eversource failed in its primary responsibility to distribute and transmit energy in our state. But it's also the failure of our state government, which has had complete legislative and regulatory oversight of Eversource for many, many years and allowed the electricity grid to degrade to the point that we're the only state in the Northeast that had problems of this magnitude. My solutions call for three different things that will both reduce the price of electricity, which, by the way, in Connecticut is the highest in the continental US, which is a huge regressive tax on families in need in this state, but also increase the reliability of the electricity grid. First, Eversource needs to have its monopoly limited. It must not vertically integrate its monopoly into electricity generation, which gives it perverse incentives and distracts it from its base goal of reliability of transmission and distribution. Second, we need to bring more clean energy that's affordable into the fold, including hydroelectric power and imported nuclear power from Eastern Connecticut and out of state. By the way, that doesn't mean we're building a nuclear plant anywhere in the state of Connecticut. That's not going to happen. Third, no more secret long-term contracts that are negotiated by Eversource, pushed by Pura, behind closed doors. We need an open, competitive process for how we're signing on electricity contracts in order to reduce costs. And we need to keep Eversource focused on its primary responsibilities.
Anything else? Yes, please. I agree. We need more competition. And in fact, Eversource failed miserably in their performance. And by contrast, United Illuminating, which has only about 20% of the customers in this state, was able to restore power to their customers 3 times faster. So bigger is not better. And we should not have a monopoly for our power, for our public utilities. So I agree, we need more competition and in all aspects. Now, I will just say that nuclear and hydropower are not the answer. Both of those are incredibly devastating to the environment and also to human health. We need more wind power, solar power, and other types of renewable energy that are not damaging to the environment or to human health. And in fact, we passed in 2019, we passed a major wind power bill in Connecticut. So we're going to see this coming on the horizon and moving us towards a clean energy future that I'm very proud to support.
I'm glad you referenced that bill, Senator. That bill was HB 7156, which included a new offshore wind plant that Eversource is actually a party to. It's a 50% equity holder. And so now it's actually generating the electricity that it's also going to be selling to customers around Connecticut. But that bill includes wholesale electricity prices that are 9.8, 9.9 cents a kilowatt hour compared to the regional price of electricity, which is about 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So my opponent and many members of our own party, and actually some members of the Republican Party in Hartford, but not all of them, voted to actually triple new electricity costs that will come online in future years. So if you think your electricity bill is high now, just wait until this new project comes online.
All right, ready for the next question?
I just had one last point.
Yes.
We do need to do everything we can to reduce prices for consumers and to make sure that our power grid is resilient. It's absolutely critical to our economy and to the quality of people's lives. I will just note that in the Connecticut State Senate, there are 36 members, 3 of whom are employees of Eversource. They're all Republican senators, and I believe that is a conflict of interest. They all voted on the bill and they should have recused themselves.
All right, next question. Mr. Fazio, you're first. Which Connecticut state government departments, agencies, or programs, if any, would you eliminate? And what is the annual savings you estimate the state would achieve from such actions?
So there are several programs in our state government that should be divested or downsized in order to save taxpayer money. One example would be Dunkin' Donuts Park, which is owned by the state government, which bleeds tens of millions of dollars a year of taxpayer money and would actually generate revenue if we sold it. The XL Center, which bleeds tens of millions of dollars in Hartford. It's a sports arena and concert center. We should divest of that. There are different programs, social programs, that could be where the resources could be shifted to some of our great nonprofits around this state, in this community, who would do a great job at providing very important basic social services at a lower cost than the state government. And there are other programs as well. There are savings to be had, but we need to focus on the cost. We need to focus on spending if we're to alleviate our budgetary problems.
Ms. Kasser?
I can't say that there is a specific department or program that we should cut. What we need to do is look for efficiencies in all departments and all programs. And one of the best ways that we could do that is to revamp the public pension system. And that's why I propose and I fought for and introduced legislation to create a shared risk program for public pensions that would reduce our overall costs and ensure full payment of pensions going forward.
Anything else? All right. And Ms. Kasser, you're first to respond. How can the state ensure that all the protections currently embedded in the Affordable Care Act do not disappear for Connecticut residents should the Supreme Court dismantle the Affordable Care Act?
Thank you for asking this question, because this is a real and present danger. On November 10th, the Supreme Court is likely to decide that people with pre-existing conditions will no longer be eligible for health insurance coverage. And that will be devastating to at least 100 million Americans. And it will drive up premiums and prescription drug costs for everybody else. What we have done in Connecticut is we passed a law. It was actually before I arrived, but it codified 10 essential health care benefits. And this is an example of what we can do at the state level to be a firewall to protect our rights when they are being stripped away at the federal level. I am very committed to achieving affordable, quality health care for every person in the state. That's why I supported the public option bill this year. That's why I introduced a public option bill for small businesses, employers, employees, and people under 30 in 2019. And I will continue to fight for that. And I would just like to note that my opponent has written an article in the Federalist that says you do not have a basic right to health care. And in fact, he has also said that the Affordable Care Act should be eviscerated.
If you're a single mom in Connecticut making $70,000 a year, about the median income, you have one kid, and you try to buy health insurance on the individual market, it'll cost you $17,000 per year out of pocket in premiums and in deductibles before your insurance kicks in. The federal system and the state system, which have been controlled by Democrats for many years, has totally failed the middle class. It's totally failed the working class in our state as it pertains to healthcare. Now, pre-existing conditions are protected in law by the federal government, they're protected in law by the state government, and that will always be the case. The problem that we have, which makes it difficult for people to access healthcare in our country and in our state in particular, is clearly the cost. That's the access problem. There are ways in which we can increase access and create healthcare jobs in particular in our state by changing regulations which restrict the actual production of healthcare, the amount of beds that hospitals or doctors can add. They're required to go to the government for a permission slip before they do that. That'll increase the amount of healthcare, that'll reduce costs, that'll increase healthcare jobs in our state. And so we need to actually focus on the supply side, the healthcare side, rather than just the insurance side. Protections for pre-existing conditions are going to remain in law in the state government and in the federal government. The question is how we increase access by reducing costs and increasing choice in healthcare.
That is false. Pre-existing conditions will not be protected, and everybody can read that in the papers today. It doesn't matter if the president writes an executive order. The Supreme Court will rule the law of the land. And when they decide on November 10th that the ACA does not require insurers to cover those with pre-existing conditions, that right will be gone. The ACA will be eviscerated. Your dream will come true, apparently. But that leaves hundreds of millions of Americans in a desperate situation where healthcare will be unaffordable, unaccessible, and people will be in dire straits. And that is something that is terrifying, it's wrong, it's inhumane. I will be fighting against that. I will be fighting to ensure that at least at the state level, where we do have some authority, we can defend against that. And I will just, again, point to this article that he wrote in the Federalist, where he says that healthcare is a right that only socialists allege exists, and that it is not a basic human right.
First of all, that's not what the article says. The article says that you have the right to access healthcare and that people have the right to produce healthcare. And by doing that, we can increase the accessibility and the production of healthcare and healthcare technologies that have enabled people to live longer lives in present day and age. But none of this is addressing the underlying problem, that it costs $17,000 out of pocket to be insured for a private individual, a single mom, making $70,000 a year in Connecticut at present, under the Affordable Care Act, under the regulations and laws passed by a Democratic state government. We need to increase the supply and production of healthcare to reduce costs. We need to give people more choice in their health insurance, and we will protect pre-existing conditions. There is unanimous support for that in the General Assembly and in Congress, irrespective of what happens in the courts.
Anything else?
All right. Next question, Mr. Fazio, you're first. This has been touched on briefly, but what specific ideas do you have to solve the pension debt crisis in the state?
A couple of weeks ago, I wrote an op-ed, and I've written several, about what our plan should be in order to alleviate the biggest millstone around the necks of the middle class in our state, which is the state budget crisis and the unfunded pension liability. In total, it's in excess of $100 billion, which divides out to about $90,000 for the average family. Most people can't afford that, and it's the reason that your taxes keep going up year after year in this state. We don't just need a financial solution, we need a legal solution in order to approach the courts and the political process. 40 out of 40 states in the past 10 years have reformed their existing pension program in order to make it solvent or affordable. Connecticut was not among them. But the doctrine has been upheld at the Supreme Court that state legislatures themselves can make alterations on the margin in order to make their states solvent. They do not surrender the sovereignty that a state inherently has by virtue of the fact that they have unaffordable contracts. We must do this. We must reduce overtime spiking. We must reduce cost of living adjustments. We must increase employee contributions to their pensions and to their health care to levels that are still below private sector levels, but are more fair and commensurate with a fair level of pay. This can be done, but it can only be done by people running for office who are making this a cause of their campaign. And my opponent in July, when a 5.5% pay increase went through for state government employees, costing hundreds of millions of dollars to the taxpayer in this state, amidst the highest unemployment since the Great Depression, my opponent didn't make a single public statement against those raises, even though the governor had emergency powers in order to stop them. That type of equity and fairness needs to be at the core of the reforms that we make so our economy can finally grow in this state.
Thank you. I agree. We do need candidates who run on this issue and have a real solution. And that's what I did in 2018. And I brought a real solution to our legislature. It's called the Shared Risk Plan. I published an article in Bloomberg about it, describing it. It is a proven solution. It's what Governor Gina Raimondo did in Rhode Island to fix their pension debt. It is not draconian. It actually creates a system in which both employer and employee share the risk of market volatility. I also introduced an amendment to the Constitution, our state Constitution, that would require full funding of pensions going forward so that this crisis that we have could not be repeated, because it only came about because of 40 years of kicking the can down the road by Republicans, Democrats, by everybody. We can't let that happen again. We need to reform the system and make sure the problem doesn't repeat. I'd like to address what my opponent said about state employee contracts. In July, it is true, an increase did go into effect. That contract had been negotiated years ago, not by me. I did say something within our caucus. I did speak out and said, this is not a time for anyone's wages to go up. We should do something to create a freeze on state employee wages. What I have been able to do, how I have been able to use my vote in the legislature, is anytime a state employee contract was voted on, I voted against it out of principle, not because they don't deserve increases. This is for police officers and Department of Child and Family Services workers. They all deserve a pay increase. But on principle, I voted against those because we hadn't yet addressed our revenue problem. We hadn't created new sources of revenue, and our state was still in a state of fiscal instability. So I voted against all of those contracts.
My opponent actually didn't vote against all of those contracts. She voted against most of those contracts, but she voted for 2 of those contracts. That's the record. Her record isn't horrible on this issue, but it's not good, and it's certainly not good enough to make the state solvent. Additionally, her role in the Democratic Party gives her a platform, and calling out as unfair those 5.5% pay increases that went into effect on July 1st, doing so publicly would have made news. It would have raised eyebrows. There's no evidence that she did it in the caucus, but even if she did it in the caucus, once they said nothing about it, even though the governor had the ability to make alterations on the margin under his emergency powers, she should have come out in public and said this is the wrong thing to do. Democratic governors around the country suspended those raises for the benefit of the middle class, for the benefit of taxpayers under their emergency powers, including in New York and Pennsylvania and Virginia. We should have done that here, and leadership and speaking out on the issue for the months ahead of the point that the raises went through would have been the right thing to do.
I have stood up to my party leaders many times. In fact, unprecedented how often I have stood up publicly to my party leaders and pushed back on ideas that they introduced, and even on ideas that the governor introduced, like regionalizing schools, which would take away local control from boards of ed. But I also work very well with my caucus, and they do listen to me. And Ryan's right. I do have a platform to make real change, because as the first Democrat to represent this district in 90 years, we finally have a seat at the table with the majority party.
Just one point. My opponent says she's stood up to her party a lot, but she voted with her party 96% of the time in the state Senate. That's a campaign talking point. It's not the reality. I don't even agree with myself 96% of the time. I don't understand how anyone could agree with their own party 96% of the time. Those are the facts, and they're inescapable.
Ryan, what you should know before you make that statement is that 90% of the time, the bills we vote on are unanimous, and 95% of the time, they are bipartisan. So in fact, I only vote with my party 1 extra % of the time. So I have taken many positions contrary to the party. I've also taken many positions with the party. I don't vote based on party. I vote based on policies and principles.
That only constitutes 14 votes total that you voted against your own party. You missed more votes than you cast against your own party. You missed 19 votes, and you cast 14 votes against your own party. Again, that's the record.
Next question. Ms. Kasser, you're the first to respond. Our state has allowed absentee ballots for all voters this year in light of the current pandemic. What permanent changes to our voting laws, such as offering early in-person voting, would you support in order to make voting a fair and simple process for all of our residents?
This is a critical issue because voting rights are determined at the state level by our state legislatures, and voting rights have become an entirely partisan issue. In fact, your right to vote during this pandemic was highly partisan. The Republicans sued Secretary of State Denise Merrill to block her from sending you absentee ballots by mail. And I have fought to expand voting rights, and I will continue to do that. I introduced legislation to allow early voting. I introduced legislation to allow no-fault absentee ballots. We came very close in 2019 to allowing early voting, which requires a constitutional amendment. Unfortunately, the measure failed because in the state Senate, Republican senators voted against it. And that is why we have to go back to the drawing board or wait 3 more years to try to amend the Constitution to allow your right to vote early.
Voting should always be easy and secure, and I'm actually in favor of expanding absentee voting, especially for this pandemic, where we should have no excuse absentee voting, but also in the long term where we should have more excuses. But Election Day is still a sacred thing in this democracy, and having as many people vote safely on Election Day is a positive if they can make it to the ballot box. Early voting would actually not alter the amount of voter turnout we have in this state. There was a Yale study recently that looked into early voting and found that there was no change to voter turnout when it was made available because it reduces the value of Election Day in the eyes of voters. So again, we need moderate solutions, not extreme solutions. And I think expanded absentee voting is the answer, but early voting and universal vote by mail is too extreme and reduces the security of the ballot box.
Well, 42 states would disagree with you. 42 states have early voting. Connecticut is an outlier. We are in the same category as Kentucky, Mississippi, South Carolina in terms of our restrictive voting rights. It is time, it is beyond time for us to modernize and to allow everybody to vote in a safe, accessible, and convenient way. And I will just say that the argument that's made that there is voter fraud that we need to protect against is also a lie. We went over all of the votes cast, the millions of votes cast in Connecticut in the last 25 years. There were only 12 cases of voter fraud. That means 99.99999911% of all votes cast in Connecticut in the last 25 years were valid. And one other thing, one other point we have to note is that my opponent actually said in the paper when the issue of absentee ballots was still being debated this summer that we should only allow absentee ballots in this pandemic for people with pre-existing conditions and medical conditions. And I would argue it is not the role of government to decide who should be safe or feel safe and determine how people want to vote. Everybody has the right to vote in a way that they feel safe and to have their vote counted.
My position was that they should have access to absentee voting if they have health concerns, and only they can verify that. So that's reasonable because all the other exceptions, it's also the voter themselves who has to verify. But the idea that there's no voter fraud is not true. Just last year, the chairman of the Stamford, Connecticut Democratic Party was arrested and charged with 14 counts of forging absentee ballots. Just last year, the Democratic mayor of Bridgeport won his primary over a woman named Senator Moore because he clearly was cheating on absentee ballots. I don't think this is necessarily widespread, but it calls for a balanced approach, not an extreme approach in one direction that enables political party machinery to harvest votes and influence how people vote.
Anything else?
42 states have early voting. It's time for Connecticut to have early voting and more voting options.
All right, we are just about time for our closing statements. I'll ask one sort of quick question, and it would be Mr. Fazio's turn. Are you participating in the Citizens Election Program to finance your campaign?
I am.
Ms. Kasser?
I am not.
Either of you care to explain why you are or are not? Mr. Fazio?
Yes, the campaign finance laws in Connecticut are pretty restrictive. I'm not personally wealthy, so I can't afford financing my election on my own. So I work within the laws of the state of Connecticut.
I fully support the Citizens Election Program. It has done a tremendous favor to the citizens of Connecticut by allowing anybody to run for office and also to limit the influence of special interests. I chose not to participate because I didn't participate last time, because I made a pledge to voters that I would not take state funding, and I didn't. And I'm not doing that now. And I'm not taking PAC money either. I am raising money from people who are committed to seeing me reelected.
All right, and on that note, it's time for closing statements. I'll let the timers shift. There are 2 minutes for each closing statement, and they will be showing you when you have a minute remaining and when you have 15 seconds remaining. And Ms. Kasser, you're the first.
Serving as your state senator is a tremendous honor. From the first day I held office, I've been fighting for you and for our state to succeed. I've done exactly what I said I would do. I've worked across the aisle, I've held both parties accountable, and I've led with real solutions and a positive vision. I fought for economic progress by introducing bold legislation to lower pension debt, modernize transportation, expand green energy, lower taxes, and help small businesses. Some of these ideas became law, others did not. But real change takes persistence, and I am persistent. The fact is that right now, Connecticut is on a good path, and if we stay safe and focused, we'll emerge from this pandemic better than before. But we can't let disinformation distract us. The idea that Democrats destroyed the state is a myth. The idea that Republicans can save us is also a myth, because political parties don't save us. Only our principles do. And even though Connecticut is on a good path, all the progress we've made is at risk. Our laws that protect public health, gun safety, the environment, education, the right to marry, and even the right to vote can be taken away. These rights are under attack from the White House and the Supreme Court, and state legislatures are the firewall to stop this. In this election, our Connecticut values are on the ballot. Thank you for joining me to defend them. Thank you for standing up and defending our democracy. Thank you for your courage.
Thank you. Mr. Fazio, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you to the League for hosting tonight, and thank you to my opponent for joining. My opponent 2 years ago won a close election by making big promises to voters. She promised to cut your taxes, but she voted to raise them by over $660 on the average family. She promised to be bipartisan, but she voted with her own party 96% of the time. And she promised to be an effective legislator more than her predecessor, but she failed to pass a single bill that she was the lead introducer of, despite 60% Democrat majorities. Now, clearly, it's time for a change. As your state senator, I'll advance a new vision to unite Democrats, Republicans, and people in between in order to put our state on the right path, back to prosperity. We need to reduce taxes on all families and create jobs in this state, a state which never recovered from the previous recession before this new one began. We need to keep schools open. We need to keep schools open safely and reduce state influence over local school districts. And finally, we need to protect the public health and safety with good, moderate policing and public health policies that limit the spread of disease, reduce crime, but also protect people's rights fairly for everyone. This district is my home. I grew up here, and I will fight for it every single day in the state Senate. Together, I hope that we can change Hartford, save Connecticut, and restore hope for our community for the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. We appreciate you being with us this evening.